Julian Coleman, a dedicated police chief, was driving home after a long but fulfilling day spent meeting with community leaders in Charlotte, North Carolina. His thoughts drifted to his wife's famous pot roast, waiting at home when flashing red and blue lights abruptly pulled him back to reality. The sight of the patrol car behind him sent a familiar tension through his body. He quickly checked his speed. 29 miles per hour, in a 35 zone. No violations, no broken taillights, yet he was being pulled over. As a black man, he knew the routine all too well. Hands visible, movements slow, voice polite. The officer approached his window, flashlight beaming into the car's interior with a sharp tone. "In a hurry tonight?" Julian remained composed, answering calmly, but suspicion lingered in the officer's voice. Accused of reckless driving and ordered to step out of the vehicle, Julian complied, though he knew the charge was false. The second officer grabbed his arm roughly, twisting it behind his back as cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. As they shoved him into the back of the squad car, Julian remained silent, calculating. The officers thought they had arrested just another man, but they had no idea who he really was. Julian sat stiffly in the back of the squad car, his hands still tingling from the tightness of the handcuffs. The two officers, Daniels and Reed, exchanged casual banter in the front seat, acting as if they hadn't just unlawfully detained a man without cause. Julian, however, remained calm. He had spent years in law enforcement, understanding both the power of the badge and the danger of unchecked authority. He knew the system well enough to recognize exactly what was happening. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about profiling. As the patrol car rolled through the quiet streets, Daniels glanced back at Julian through the rearview mirror. "So, what's your story? Late-night drug run? Or do you just like giving us a hard time?" His voice carried a mocking edge. Julian met his gaze without flinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home," he replied evenly. Reed scoffed. "Yeah, sure. They always say that." Their dismissive attitudes made it clear. They had already judged him, assumed he was guilty of something. When they arrived at the precinct, the fluorescent lights of the holding area cast a harsh glow over the room. Daniels removed Julian's handcuffs with a mocking flourish. "Welcome to our humble abode," he sneered. "You'll be here for a while." Julian rubbed his wrists, keeping his expression neutral. "Am I being charged?" he asked calmly. Reed smirked. "We'll let you know once we figure that out." Julian was led into a small, cold holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him. Sitting on the bench, he remained composed, his mind already working. The officers thought they had control of the situation. They had no idea just how wrong they were. Julian sat on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell, his hands clasped together as he replayed the night's events in his mind. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow over the empty room. Outside he could hear officers moving about, paperwork shuffling, quiet laughter from the two men who had put him here. Daniels and Reed had no idea who they had just arrested, and they certainly didn't expect any consequences for their actions. From his position, Julian could hear their conversation clearly. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Daniels muttered, as he reviewed Julian's license and registration. "Doesn't matter," Reed replied with a smirk. "We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet." Julian remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Their arrogance didn't surprise him. He had seen officers like them before, men who wielded their badges as weapons, assuming their power was absolute. Hours passed, the air in the cell growing heavier with time. Then, finally, footsteps approached. Julian looked up as a stern-looking officer, clearly of higher rank, stopped in front of the bars. Lieutenant Morgan. Her badge gleamed under the harsh lights, and her expression was unreadable as she glanced at Julian, then back at the paperwork in her hands. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her tone sharp. Daniels straightened. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest," he answered, a little too quickly. Morgan's brow furrowed. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" "We haven't processed it yet," Reed said casually. Morgan exhaled sharply. "Get it now. And Daniels, my office, now." Julian leaned back slightly. The tide was beginning to turn. Julian remained seated in the holding cell, his posture steady as Lieutenant Morgan strode away, her expression dark with displeasure. He had dealt with officers like Daniels and Reed before, men who believed they were untouchable, who relied on power and intimidation rather than integrity and justice. But he also knew that arrogance often led to mistakes. Minutes later, he heard hurried footsteps returning. Morgan appeared again, this time holding a tablet in her hands. Her jaw was set, her eyes sharp as she gestured for Julian to step closer to the bars. "We reviewed your dash cam footage," she said, her tone clipped but professional. "I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear. This should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely." Julian remained expressionless, though inside he felt a small wave of satisfaction. He had known the truth would come out eventually. Morgan exhaled, shaking her head. "I'll be releasing you immediately," she continued, unlocking the cell door herself. "But I'd like to discuss next steps privately." As Julian stepped out of the cell, he caught a glimpse of Daniels and Reed standing near the desk, their faces stiff with unease. The confidence they had displayed hours earlier had faded. They now realized they had made a critical error. In Morgan's office, she studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "I have to ask, who are you really? Most people wouldn't have handled this the way you did." Julian gave her a small, measured smile. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. But let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm." Morgan nodded. "Fair enough. But something tells me this isn't the last we'll hear of this." She was right. As Julian stepped out of the precinct into the crisp morning air, the weight of the night still lingered on his shoulders. He didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove toward the one place where he knew real change had to start: his office. Parking in his reserved space, he walked through the front doors of the police headquarters, his presence unexpected but commanding. His assistant Anita looked up in surprise. "Chief Coleman, you're here early." Julian gave her a small nod, his expression neutral. "It's been a long night. Anita, could you prepare a briefing room for me? I need to address the department this afternoon." She nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his tone. As Julian stepped into his office, closing the door behind him, he took a deep breath. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about what his experience represented. That afternoon, Julian stood at the front of the briefing room, facing a sea of officers, some curious, some tense. He scanned the room before speaking. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, and as long as I'm chief, I won't tolerate it." The room fell silent. Officers shifted uncomfortably, some looking at each other, others staring straight ahead. "We are here to serve and protect," Julian continued, his voice unwavering. "Not to harass and intimidate. If you can't uphold those values, then this isn't the place for you." The message was clear. Change was coming. Julian wasn't just a police chief. He was a man on a mission. And the department, whether they liked it or not, was about to change for the better. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick in the air as Julian sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer, Sandra Reyes, calmly flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Across from them, officers Daniels and Reed sat with their department-appointed attorney. Daniels looked nervous, his foot tapping uncontrollably, while Reed leaned back in his chair, wearing a smug expression, an arrogance that wouldn't last much longer. The judge, an older man with a stern demeanor, called the session to order. The prosecution began, outlining the case based on the officer's report. On the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest. Sandra barely concealed a smirk and leaned over to Julian. "They're walking right into it," she whispered. When it was her turn, she stood confidently, her voice cutting through the room. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are baseless, a direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I present video evidence that contradicts the officer's statements." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The courtroom fell silent as the dashcam footage played. It showed Julian driving steadily, never swerving. Then came the bodycam footage, capturing the officer's aggressive tone. The most damning moment arrived, a recording of Daniels muttering, "Another one of them causing trouble," followed by Reed's chuckle, "Figures." Gasps rippled through the room. Sandra turned to the jury. "This isn't just an abuse of power. It's a violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias." Then Julian stood. Adjusting his tie, he spoke firmly. "My name is Julian Coleman. I am the chief of police for this city." The courtroom erupted. Daniels and Reed's confidence shattered. Justice was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Julian's revelation settled over the stunned audience. Daniels and Reed sat frozen, their faces drained of color. The judge banged his gavel for silence, his expression now unreadable. After a brief recess, court resumed, but the tone had completely shifted. The prosecution, visibly shaken, had little left to argue. With overwhelming evidence against the officers, the judge swiftly dismissed the charges against Julian. As he stepped outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his direction. "Chief Coleman, do you have a statement about the case?" one called out. Julian raised a hand, signaling for silence. "This case isn't just about me," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every citizen, regardless of who they are, is treated with dignity and fairness. As chief of police, I am committed to leading a department that values integrity, and as a citizen, I will continue to fight for justice." The fallout was swift. Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Public outrage grew as the footage was released, sparking protests and demands for reform. Community leaders called for greater transparency, while activists pushed for new policies to prevent similar abuses. Inside the precinct, Julian gathered his officers for an emergency meeting. Standing at the front of the room, he scanned the faces before him. "What happened to me last night was not an isolated incident," he said. "It's a symptom of a larger problem. And as long as I'm chief, I will not tolerate it. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. If you cannot uphold those values, this is not the place for you." A new era had begun. Change was coming. In the weeks following the courtroom revelation, Julian wasted no time in implementing the changes he had long envisioned. His experience had exposed not just the misconduct of 2 officers, but a systemic issue that needed urgent reform. He began by instituting mandatory bias training for all officers, ensuring that law enforcement personnel understood the importance of fair and just policing. He also introduced stricter oversight measures, requiring all stops and arrests to be thoroughly documented and reviewed. Perhaps most importantly, he launched an anonymous reporting system, allowing both officers and citizens to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The community responded with cautious optimism. Protests gradually turned into town hall meetings, where citizens voiced their concerns and proposed solutions. Julian attended every session, listening intently, taking notes, and making it clear that he was not just a figurehead. He was there to lead by example. Though trust in law enforcement had been shaken, his proactive approach slowly started to mend the fractures between the department and the people it was meant to serve. Despite these efforts, Julian knew real change wouldn't happen overnight. Resistance from within the department was inevitable. Some officers resented the new policies, viewing them as restrictions rather than improvements. But Julian was unwavering. "If accountability feels like a burden," he told them, "then you were never meant to wear the badge." Months later, at a town hall meeting, a young man stood up and spoke, his voice cracking. "Chief Coleman, what happened to you? It could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up." Julian nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but together we can build a system that truly serves everyone." The fight for justice was far from over, but it had begun. As the town hall meeting concluded, Julian lingered for a moment, watching people leave with a renewed sense of hope. The fight for justice was far from over, but momentum was building. His experience had sparked a conversation that could no longer be ignored. Across the city, people were speaking up, demanding accountability, and pushing for reforms that would ensure no one else had to endure what he had. Julian knew that lasting change required more than policies. It required a shift in culture. He continued meeting with community leaders, training officers, and reinforcing the values that law enforcement should uphold. His message was clear. The badge was not a shield for abuse, but a symbol of service and integrity. Meanwhile, the public remained vigilant. Citizens understood that their voices held power, that justice depended not only on those in authority, but on their willingness to demand it. Standing outside the precinct one evening, Julian took a deep breath. The road ahead was long, but he was ready. His fight wasn't just about one night. It was about ensuring a system where accountability wasn't just a promise, but a reality. And with the community by his side, he knew change was possible. The story of Julian Coleman carries profound lessons about justice, leadership, and resilience, principles that remain relevant throughout life, especially for those who have witnessed societal changes over decades. One key lesson is the importance of integrity in leadership. Julian's ability to remain composed in the face of injustice underscores the power of dignity and self-control. True leadership is not about wielding authority, but about upholding values even in adversity. Another vital message is the necessity of accountability. Systems of power, whether in law enforcement, governance, or institutions, must be held to ethical standards. This responsibility does not rest solely on leaders but on society as a whole. As engaged citizens, we must demand fairness and transparency, ensuring that respect for human dignity remains a priority. Lastly, the story teaches that change is possible, but it requires persistence. Reform is often met with resistance, yet history has shown that progress is made when people refuse to accept injustice as the norm. No matter one's age, advocating for truth and fairness is a lifelong commitment. Julian's journey reminds us that true change begins when we stand firm in our principles and inspire others to do the same.